I've never been to Austin, so this is really great weather for welcoming me here for the weekend. So as Meredith said, I'm Maude. This is my Twitter handle. I work at Slack. This is my husband and me. We're weirdly matching this picture. And I've lived and worked at Slack for just over 2 years. And this is your warning now that most of the GIFs, but one in this presentation, are from the Great British Baking Show. I love the show. Shout out for the Great British Baking Show. I watched through most of it when I had my wisdom teeth removed a couple months ago. It was really good motivation to get better and then eat a lot of sweet things. So if you have any problems with cake, I'm sorry, but also not sorry. So let's start with the definition, because that's what people do, right? Refactoring, what is it? This is the Webster's Dictionary definition. It's the process of restructuring existing code, e.g. the factoring, without changing any of its external behavior. So let's say, for instance, you have a cake recipe. A millefeuille, for example, which is a very delicious French cake. It is called 1,000 leaves, if you don't speak French. And say this is the recipe that your grandmother really, really carefully wrote down as best as she remembered for future generations to enjoy it. But unfortunately, some of the instructions are a little bit convoluted, and ordering is a little bit difficult to follow. So, as an experienced baker, you could easily create a delicious dessert from this recipe, but you end up annotating it with tips. And eventually you realize that you have more tips than actual recipe. And so you add things like this, or maybe this, and maybe this. And eventually you decide, OK, I just need to rewrite the entire recipe and put all this stuff in there. And once you've done that, it feels great. You're like, great, awesome, clean recipe. I can pass this on to people now, and they'll know what a crème pâtissière really is. But in the world of business, it's a little bit more complicated than that. You don't have free time to just rewrite your grandmother's cake recipe. And you can't just go around refactoring everything. These are not reasons to refactor. Most companies have new features to develop, bug fixes to ship, and generally speaking, these are almost always higher priority, right? So refactoring for fun or out of boredom is just not a good use of engineering time. Some of us would like to spend the entirety of our working hours refactoring. I am one of those people. But let's be honest, you're paid to do a lot more than just that. And if it's not fun, sometimes our jobs just aren't 100% fun 100% of the time, and that's OK. So if you're bored and you're not quite sure what to do next, you should probably ask your EM or your PM. And show of hands, how many of us have revisited code that we wrote only to find out that it's been completely rewritten? Yeah, very real. Chances are it fell prey to the drive-by refactorer. This is the programmer who wanders through the code, fixing bugs, building new features, but rewriting pretty much everything in their path. And they think they're doing everyone a favor by improving the code. But consider this. What they might not realize is that by not having a conversation with the original code author, they're actively degrading that trust. And they're bypassing the opportunity to have a conversation with the author about their original design decisions. So don't be a drive-by refactorer, be an intentioned, communicative refactorer. And even as an intentioned refactorer, you might think that the logical justification, right, of making the code more legible and extensible maps directly to your team's ability to iterate quickly. But sometimes the initial time investment of rewriting that code might not pay off. It might not pay off for the lifetime of that feature. It might not pay off for the lifetime of your company if you're working at a really tiny startup. So unless you have a tangible set of goals, a compelling argument that will directly and positively impact the bottom line, and here I'm referring to the financial bottom line, you'll most likely fall on deaf ears. There's a reason why sometimes we say, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And honestly, it's a pretty reasonable mantra to live by, especially when you're working at a really high growth company. So when is actually the right time to refactor? I'm really glad all of you asked. When there is, say, a shift in product requirements. This is not an exhaustive list of reasons. This is just some really good ones. So I won't dig into the first two examples, but the third and the final reason is how I've gotten away with refactoring huge swaths of Slack's application code over the last year and a half-ish. What could go wrong? So there's a few caveats to keep in mind when proposing an actual refactor. Whether it's large or small, refactoring can cause some really serious regressions. This has happened to me. You can unearth dormant bugs. This has also happened to me. And the refactor can easily grow in scope. And think of this like tiny little snowball that starts off at the top of this hill, and as it's rolling down, it's just like accumulating random branches and small rocks, and it's just growing and growing, and speeding up as it goes all the way down. It's just a really bad time. So stick to what you need and keep it simple. That'll help you, 1, meet your deadline, and 2, ensure that other engineers who come after you aren't scrambling to understand some randomly over-engineered solution. So that said, let's revisit our definition of refactoring. Refactoring. The process by which we take a pile of poo and turn it into a slightly shinier pile of poo. Refactoring will never render something perfect. We have to be able to accept that. In the meantime, however, it might render it just a teensy bit shinier. And if you only take one thing away from this talk, it should be this. So you can stop listening now if you really don't want to. So let's cover some of the things that have happened. Storytime. In May of 2017, we were fighting quite a few fires at Slack. Some of our biggest customers are on the East Coast. So on Monday mornings, when everyone logged into Slack at 9 a.m. Eastern, that meant 6 a.m. for us. Everything inevitably went to a pile of poo, and we had to be ready to tackle whatever the latest and greatest bottleneck turned out to be. And we started seeing some patterns in the types of problems that these customers were experiencing over and over again. So we decided to narrow it down. With any refactoring work, you want to narrow it down to what the actual problem is. And that sounds really silly, but if you haven't identified it properly, you run way too easily into the risk of, 1, fixing a problem you don't actually have, or 2, extending the scope of work beyond what is actually really necessary. So in our case, we identified that one of the constant sources of bottlenecks was around fetching a user's channel membership. So if you're not familiar with Slack, this is kind of what it looks like when you load it up, a little bit, not exactly. And all the bolded channels, and those are channels, have unread messages. And you have all of your public and private channels in one top section, and then you have your direct messages and group direct messages in the bottom section. So on startup for every single client, we attempt to fetch all of your channel memberships in order to show this nice little bar to you for your public channels and your private channels, everything. And you don't get this view unless we're able to pull that information. We have a lot of things at Slack. So I pulled these stats a couple weeks ago, so it's a little bit stale because Slack is very high growth and things change a lot. But I wanted to give everyone a sense of scale of what fetching channel and channel membership can look like. So there's a couple users who are in over 100,000 public channels. Yeah. There's users in more than 1 million group DMs. And there's some users in 5 million DMs. That's actually Slackbot, so it's in a DM with everyone, but you know. So how do we store this information? And what are our access patterns? What do they look like? Why did it become such a huge problem? So we have 2 tables that store nearly identical information at this point. We have the channels table, which stores a row for every single public channel, and we have the groups table, which stores a row for every single private channel, or group DM. Sure. We also have 2 tables that store also nearly identical information. We have channels members, which stores a row for every user's membership in a public channel, and then we have groups members, which stores a row for every user's membership in a private channel or a group DM. This is kind of what the schemas looked like in mid-2017. DMs are special. And so in a lot of cases, we ended up with a ton of queries to multiple tables that did some not so great things with unions, union alls, left outer joins, left inner joins. And these aren't really awesome for performance. And if you are not familiar with MySQL and general SQL performance, here's SQL 102. Union removes duplicate records, and so it has to do an extra pass to make sure that in the result set, you're not going to have duplicate rows. Union all returns everything, so no distinctness check, so less time hopefully spent in that query. Left outer joins is generally slower than left inner joins, but sometimes it's the other way around, depending on how it's populating all of those null values across the result set. So we used a lot of explains a lot of the time to try to figure out, OK, given this table, this type of query, how many rows is it looking at? What are the indices that it's hitting? What type of query is it actually doing? How can we make it better? And that's great, but it's also not that great when these queries are written in code, like actual business logic code. And this is one of those cases where you literally have do some stuff at the top, like, I don't know, set a user to delete it, and then you do this thing, and then you execute the query. And at the time, there was this added bonus, right, that we just had SQL queries strewn throughout the entire code base. And it was not, and in some cases still is not, uncommon to come across this level of complexity in just regular business logic. So now that we understand the problem, we have to get some context and understand why it was designed that way originally. I firmly believe that you cannot set out to improve something until you understand how it came about in the first place. And why is that? Code isn't written in a vacuum. So if you don't understand the original constraints, you might introduce completely new problems that were avoided from the very start. If you have the opportunity to sit down with the original authors, you'll gain incredible insight into what they were thinking at the time. And you'll also ensure that the experience of writing that first iteration is just not isolated to a few engineers anymore, and the knowledge lives on. So we make the best of what we have given our resources, time, money, experience, whatever. And sometimes bad design is just the outcome of limited resources. So luckily at Slack, some of our founding engineers are still around. I was able to have these conversations with some of these people. And turns out I got a lot of really good insight. So one of the original reasons why it was designed this way was for security. Keeping private channel information in a separate table literally just isolates it from everything else. And so if you knew that you were reading from the private channel information table, you knew that you had to be extra vigilant about permissions that people had to see that information. We also had this context of product history. Channels and private channels at the time seemed like really vastly different concepts. And so that's why they seemed to go very well into two different tables. I also put this reason of the inability to travel into the future because hindsight is 20/20, and we think we have some insight into where we're headed from a product standpoint, an engineering standpoint, whatever, but we can't anticipate absolutely everything. So decisions around storing channel and channel membership information date back to before the product was even launched, and we couldn't predict the scale at which we'd be operating 5 years later. The enterprise product launch, or shared channels between teams, which completely breaks this barrier. And as we adapt to the market and we gain more traction and we mature also as a company, our code also has to mature and our infrastructure as well. So we have to be willing to ask the hard questions and revisit our decisions. So now we understand what the problem is, we understand why the problem came about, and we understand the history behind all of the initial design. So what's next? We brainstorm a solution and identify the challenges. So remember this. We decided, let's consolidate everything membership related into one table. Let's do this. And it might not be so simple because, as I mentioned, the SQL queries were gathered throughout the code. There was about 400 different call sites across, I don't know, 100-ish files. And most of these call sites were embedded into really old, crufty code from 3 years ago. You know that when you do a git blame and it's your CTO, you're in for a really great time. And there was basically no unit test coverage for most of this stuff because, hey, it was written before the product launched. So now we have a sense of, what we're stepping into. Given all that, you got to sell your team. It's not enough to just convince yourself that refactoring is worth it. You have to sell everyone on it. And if your leadership isn't sold on the benefits, then it won't be prioritized, and you'll need to be able to secure the time and resources to really succeed because, let's be honest, no one needs a half-finished refactor. So this is how we brought it up to our leadership. We said, our biggest customers literally will not be able to handle the additional latency in a few months. That sounds pretty bad. There's only so much money you can throw at AWS before you have to take a hard look in the mirror and start figuring out those problems at home. We were at a critical point where we had enough of a runway to concentrate some effort on consolidating these tables, but we were also incredibly close to staring down the barrel of these customers' guns, so this was a really important time to make that decision. We also pointed out that while we're making changes to these tables, we'll have the opportunity to consolidate all of our call sites into a single file and then establish a prototype for accessing data through a single file pattern, and then maybe have other tables follow suit. We also have the opportunity to determine a pattern for making changes to those tables once they're in those files, because really the pattern before was add the table, add the column, grep the code base, hope you found all the places where it needs to be used. And after some inevitable back and forth between everyone, we secured buy-in from leadership. So then we have to actually write down everything we plan to do. And this ensures that all the stakeholders know what's happening and when it's happening. For this particular effort, because it was a months-long project and it involved a lot of moving pieces and literally affected the code that everyone else was writing, I was getting DM'd a lot from a lot of different people across the entire company. And being able to direct all of them just back to the document instead of answering individual questions over and over and over again saved me a ton of time. Turns out when you have a question about this sort of thing, chances are 5 other people also have the same question about this sort of thing. So it all just ended up in this one handy document that looked a little bit like this, but it also went on for 10 more steps, and you don't need to read this. But it's a quick snapshot of what it looked like and various things that we thought about. And it's worth noting that while the document grew in detail and had an FAQ section, all this stuff, it didn't grow in scope. So I didn't suddenly add oh, we'll also do this because, while we're at it. No. Be careful. Do not bite off more than you can chew. Folks wanted me to tackle migrating another table while I was at it, or figure out a path to change how we store channel privacy, because we have direct messages, group direct messages, private channels, public channels. They wanted me to find a perfect way to create this interface where we had this one file that had all the SQL queries. I'm not going to do that in the time span of just getting this out. So it's important that you keep the scope to something you can actually handle and not to promise more than what you can deliver on, which I know people say a lot. But in this case, with these huge refactors, failure is inevitable and deadlines might actually be missed. So having said that, the potential for making mistakes is very high. So I highly recommend adding a section to any plan that enumerates things that could go wrong, even if they're really, really unlikely. Just put it in there. It gives stakeholders a sense of where to potentially expect some chaos before they're completely thrown off and surprised by it, and shows that you've really thought everything through. Think about things like data loss, right? How would you recover if we suddenly lost 3 million channels? For what types of data is it most likely to occur? Why? Think about the sorts of behaviors that customers might notice also during the refactor. So which features are most likely to be affected, in what ways, how critical are these to the application? And in light of all of this, it's also really critical to spend time accounting for debugging. A few other tips. Feedback from other teams is absolutely critical. So folks have completely different perspectives from your own, different experiences, and that's what makes working with a diverse team really rewarding. Ensure that those teams that you're seeking feedback from are stakeholders for different services across your application. So for example, we knew that this would affect the data pipelines and the data warehouse people, so we preemptively told them a month before we started on this, hey, by the way, this is our plan, this is what we're going to be doing, what's going to break? And finding out about a hefty refactor only after it's happened and accidentally stumbling upon it is also not awesome. So under promise, over deliver, good motto for a reason. Of course, if you don't want to be on complete opposite sides of the spectrum there, but it's important to give yourself some wiggle room. So wiggle room for solving bugs, for getting pulled into an unexpected incident, doing your regular job, going on vacation. Account for time going on vacation. And then finally, it's time to get it done. At this point, feature flags are your friend. If you don't have them, please have them. They're great. When in doubt, we just didn't turn anything on. So we used feature flags to wrap everything, all of our changes, and continually deploy everything into production as we went along. If there was literally any doubt that it should be wrapped in a feature flag, we just wrapped it in a feature flag anyway. And as we were moving all these call sites to this one location, we set up some flags to control when and where to double write data. We wrapped calls to read from the new tables under all sorts of flags. And any particularly terrifying queries on their own, so like that big one from earlier, we put in their own flags, and then we turned just those on at one point. We monitored traffic and made sure that errors weren't going up for those particularly critical ones. Graphs are also great, and dashboards are also great. So we had a whole bunch of graphs piped through Grafana. If you want to know more about our logging and whatever, come ask me at office hours. But I had a whole bunch of dashboards that were mapping data inconsistencies across all of our tables, across our entire fleet of databases. We had graphs to make sure that every time we were flipping a flag on in production, we weren't seeing more errors than we were expecting to. We have channels that pipe alerts directly into Slack that we were monitoring. We kept an eye on the levels of 500s in API calls. And as careful as you want to be, bugs are actually inevitable. And early on, while moving some call sites, so we have this feature where you can turn a group DM into a private channel and then like add more than 9 people to it. And I prevented about 300 people from making those for about 3 hours. Thankfully, it was pretty easy to recover from, and not a lot of people know about that feature, so it could have been a lot worse than it actually was. But hey, it happened, and then I wrote that down, and I documented why it happened, and it was great. Because documentation is really awesome. And refactoring isn't super visible work. And in fact, if you're doing really well with it, no one should notice that you're doing it at all. And you can make that work visible. There is a way to do that, and that's with documentation, right? You can show the value that you've brought to the company by keeping track of everything you've improved as you've gone along. I didn't do nearly enough of this when consolidating membership, the first piece of this, but I came to realize really how important it was when I began telling other engineers around the organization all about all these weird random bugs we found and how we fixed them along the way. And I started keeping this laundry list of bugs we fixed and queries we improved when we were starting to consolidate all this information. And we found really great stuff. Like, for example, there's 9 million individual conversations between Slackbot and Slackbot across all of Slack. If you don't know the default Slackbot message, when you type to it something it doesn't understand, it says, "I'm afraid I don't understand, I'm sorry." And there's one particular DM that had over 22 million messages in it. And I have no idea what those messages are, because I can't go read that data. But I have a theory: we either invented AI, or it's just a lot of this back and forth forever. But slightly more seriously, one of those wins was being able to introduce soft channel membership deletion. So I actually sat down with our CTO a while ago, and I was like, why do we hard delete channel membership? When people leave channels, why do we just like obliterate that row? And he's like, we forgot. And I was like, cool. So at the time that we were consolidating all of this stuff, you really, really left that channel when you left it. And it was incredibly difficult to recover from incidents because we had to pull backups to be able to play through all the bin logs up until the point of the incident, and then recreate all those channel memberships at that time. And when we delete a user, we also delete all of their channel membership. So anytime we had like events where people were accidentally being deleted, customers were writing in being like, hey, so we deleted those users, but like we didn't mean to, so could you like recreate them and then like put them back in all their channels, and you're like, oh no, not this again. So because all the queries that dealt with channel membership were all in one place now, it was really easy to just grep that one file and say, hey, I'm adding a new column. It's called date deleted. We're going to update it when people leave channels, and then we're going to clear it out when people re-enter channels, and then we won't have this problem ever again. It's really awesome. So we did it, and let's celebrate. It's really, 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 really important to celebrate your achievements, especially for types of projects like this where they're essentially invisible. And if you're not, and you're not taking the time to appreciate the good you've brought into the world, you might burn out a little faster, and that's not great. And it's especially critical to take the time to recognize hitting smaller milestones along that path when you're tackling this like multi-quarter, multi-year type of project. So when your teammates are accustomed to shipping new features every few weeks, switching gears to this type of project can really, really hurt. And I unfortunately don't have a picture of this. I really wish I did. But our manager literally brought us in a cake that said channels members on it when we finally flipped off reading from the other channel membership tables. I'm pretty sure the people at Suzy Cakes were like, what am I writing on this cake? But you're not done yet, right? You have cleanup to do, and you inevitably made some trade-offs along the way, writing a slightly hacky solution for a niche case, or omitting some tricky test cases. Make sure that you leave everything in sparkly, shiny poo state. There's no confusion for the developers who come after you and who think, is this pre or post refactor? What's going on here? It's really easy to call things done and leave all those like tens of feature flags around that we left. Don't be that person. That'd be great. So in case you'd forgotten, we had this. And then eventually, we got around to consolidating all of the channel information. So now that lives in one place. And as of Monday, everything in production looks like this. So, MBD. Refactoring, it can be a win-win for both engineers and your business, but it has to be carefully scoped and planned out. Piece of cake. Thank you.